Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here with Ray. I hope everybody's getting settled in. And we're going to give everybody just a few more minutes to log into the system, and we will get started around 10:03, 10:04 a.m. Eastern time, and wherever you are located in the world. We have people from all over the world. I got some emails from people in Spain this morning, and Europe, and down into Mexico, and the U.S. of course, and Canada. So very excited to have a very wide array of people. We have about 350 people registered for this webinar, so we're very excited. And we're seeing people, if you need a coffee or water, please don't hesitate to go run and grab some, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. You should be able to see both Ray and myself on webcam. Hopefully you can hear me well. If you have any sort of audio problems, you can put that into the chat window. I'm not sure I can help you, but you can put that into the chat window, and I'm going to get started in just 2-3 minutes. So get settled in. Thank you. All right, great. So my name is Jonathan. I'm the president founder of Mnemonic, and I'm here with Raimund Laqua of Lean Compliance, who's also the founder, and I think your title, you said, was Chief Compliance Officer. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Great. So I just want to do some sort of housekeeping notices about how the webinar is going to happen and the different functionalities, and then we'll dive into the actual webinar today. So go to webinar. You should all have a panel on the right-hand side with a whole bunch of options. For those of you who haven't used it very much in the past, there is a chat box on the right-hand side. So if you click on chat, you can enter a chat message in there. You can use that if you're having any sort of technical problems or if you have any sort of administrative questions. There's also a questions box or functionality on the right-hand side. And so if you have questions for myself or for Ray about any material that you've seen today, please post your questions in there. We're going to tackle most of the questions at the end of the presentation. If there's a question that's very specific to part of the presentation, I will be monitoring them and trying to jump in as appropriate. But if it's not an urgent question, we'll be tackling it at the end. But feel free to post as many questions as you like into the questions panel. We're going to have 5 polls throughout this presentation so that we get a sense of who's in the audience, who's listening, what some of your challenges are. So I'll be managing those polls, and we'll fill them in as we move through the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be an exit survey. We just want to get your feedback on if you found the presentation useful, powerful, effective, etc. The more feedback you provide us, the better we can improve our future presentations, our future webinars. Also, if you have ideas or requests for other types of webinars, other subjects you'd like to hear about from industry experts, please enter that into the exit survey. It's very important, really does matter a lot to our continuous improvement process. If anybody is interested in learning more about Mnemonic or about Lean Compliance, today is not a sales pitch. We're not here to sell either of our services. We're really here to hopefully educate everybody and give you some tools to move forward in this crazy world we live in. But if you would like more information about either Mnemonic, products and services or lean compliance products and services, please don't hesitate to put that in the exit survey, put that in the questions, send us an email, smoke signals, faxes, anything, telegrams. We accept all forms of communication almost. So that's about mnemonic or lean compliance demonstrations and discussions. All right. There is a handouts box also on the right hand side. In that handouts field, we have put the presentation today, so the PDF of today's presentation from Ray, as well as a standard presentation about mnemonic and what mnemonic does. So if you'd like to download a set of the slides, they were also sent out by email yesterday, but if you didn't get them, you can download them from the handouts box on the right hand side. All right, we're almost done with the housekeeping stuff. Just so everybody knows, video recording of this webinar will be available to everybody, and it will be sent to you automatically one day after the webinar. It will also eventually be posted on our website, but you'll get it by email about 24 hours from now. And if you're interested in past webinars that Mnemonic has done, you can always go to mnemonic.com/webinars and you'll see all the previous webinars that we've done. We also did a podcast with Ray last year, which you can find as well on our website on the podcast page. I think that's about it in terms of housekeeping. I'm just going to take a quick peek. I do see a couple questions have come in. All right. Okay, we've got a lot of questions already coming in, so great stuff. We're going to try and tackle those questions as we get into the presentation, but I want to keep this moving along. So in terms of time today, we did put 2 hours on the schedule. There's a lot of material to cover. COVID and risk management and recovery is going to be big, complex, and I don't want to pretend that we have all the answers. But the basic agenda today is I'm going to do a very small intro, 10 minutes about mnemonic and compliance, then transition it over to Ray. Ray is going to do the presentation that was shared with you yesterday, try and provide as much information and tools as possible while doing those 5 polls. Hopefully we'll wrap that up in about an hour, and that will leave us an hour to do Q&A as well as work through any concrete examples or challenges that people have. And that's basically at a high level what we're going to cover today. So we've got a lot of material to get through. I think there's some really great stuff in here that's very actionable for companies all around the world. So let me jump into the mnemonic presentation. We're going to turn our webcams off just for a moment, and I'll do the mnemonic presentation, then we'll hand it over to Ray in just a few minutes. Okay, so let me share my screen. So now hopefully everybody can see my screen. You should see comprehensive compliance, preparing for a post-COVID, risk compliance, and more. So just as a very high level intro about what does mnemonic do, for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with us, we offer web and mobile compliance solutions. So it's a web software with some mobile tools to help you ensure comprehensive compliance. We collaborate with experts to implement this solution. So Ray is an old-time collaborator. He has deep expertise in compliance and risk management, especially in some high-risk industries like oil and gas and pipelines. So we've been working with Ray, and we think a lot of what he writes about on his site, on his blog, is really industry leading, and we're very thrilled to work with experts like Ray all around the world. And then we have a huge database at Mnemonic of laws, regulations, guidance documents for about 45 countries and 200 jurisdictions. And I was looking at the database yesterday. There's a ton of COVID related stuff in there, and I don't anticipate that to slow down. So that's a very little bit about Mnemonic. Like I said, it's not a sales pitch today, but if you'd like to learn more, you can certainly contact us. So as I said, the agenda is going to be just a brief intro about Mnemonic, the actual workshop and webinar conducted by Raimund Laqua, and then some Q&A at the end. So just put things in context a little bit. I think all businesses, as well as governments, any organization, kind of grows and develops along what we call a compliance maturity. Now, this is just our version of it. You've probably seen some other versions where businesses and organizations move from this kind of reactive world of just reacting to incidents to non-compliance issues to crazy situations like COVID and epidemics and hygiene crises, all the way to the ultimate goal is to have everybody in your organization know exactly what they need to do, when they need to do it, and why they need to do it. And of course, there's a lot of gray area between the reactive and the fully integrated system. And humans are complicated and messy, so this is very difficult stuff. I don't want to pretend that this is easy. And we hope that what we provide to you today will help you move your organization along this maturity scale all the way over to an integrated and reduce waste and reduce challenges in your business related to compliance and related to risk management. And so fundamentally at Mnemonic, and one of the reasons we partner with Ray is because we feel that he has this same belief. And the belief is that modern organizations can operate efficiently and satisfy their customers without violations, spills, product recalls, worker injuries, health issues, public safety issues. The analogy I like to make is that compliance today is like the quality crisis of the 1970s and 80s, when the automobiles came in from Japan, from Toyota and other companies, and their quality and their cost was much lower than a lot of European or US cars at the time. People used to think that quality was expensive. But what you showed was that if you solved quality at the root before it became a problem, it was actually more efficient. And we believe that to be true for compliance. If you solve compliance before it becomes a problem, it makes your business much more efficient. And we believe that businesses and organizations can do this with an approach that we call comprehensive compliance. And so what do we mean by comprehensive compliance? Quite simply, comprehensive compliance is a compliance program that captures all of your obligations across the variety of issues that you face, environmental, product. In the case of COVID, it's going to be biological hazards, public health, things like that. So all of your compliance obligations across your issues from the different sources. So from the governments, from standards bodies, from your customers, from stakeholders. You have all these different people and organizations that are imposing compliance obligations on you, and you need to stay up to speed with that. So if you capture all your obligations across the issues and across the sources, and then enable your staff to manage their actions, what do they need to do to stay in compliance, and then manage audits to make sure they're staying in compliance in a timely manner. So if you can make sure, like I said earlier, that your staff knows what to do, when to do it, and why they should do it, you will have solved the vast majority of your compliance problems, and you will avoid a lot of problems that are very expensive. So that's really what we mean when we say comprehensive compliance. So I think hopefully Ray agrees a lot with this. I think his blogs and his comments publicly have shown that he's very much aligned with this vision of what compliance can be. And so very simply put it, Mnemonic, what we believe is that if you can figure out what are your obligations, what are your actions, and what audits do you need to do to determine if the actions are taken and if the actions are effective, if you can do those three things, then you can prevent problems before they occur. And that's really what you want to do, is you want to prevent problems before they occur. So Mnemonic, we've tracked already over 230 regulations about COVID, so mostly things related to, back to work, social distancing, hygiene, etc. So over 230 actual regulations that have been passed through the regulators. And then we have over 1,000 notices and guidelines that are published by different public health authorities, different government institutions, standards bodies, etc. So this is a very fast-moving set of obligations. It's changing every day, and it's very, very challenging for organizations to keep up with this. But Mnemonic is tracking all of this, and if you'd like more information, you can certainly contact us. Okay, that's a little bit about Mnemonic and our vision of the compliance world. I'd like to now introduce Raimund Laqua. So Raimund Laqua is the founder and chief compliance engineer at Lean Compliance Consulting, and his focus is on helping ethical and ambitious companies in highly regulated, high-risk industries improve the effectiveness of their compliance programs, from health and safety and security to quality, regulatory, and environmental objectives. He's an engineer by training. He studied a McMaster engineer, and he's been doing this work for over 25 years with deep technical knowledge and taking a strategic approach to advance critical process within oil and gas, energy, pharma, medical science, government, and technology companies. His blog is fantastic. If you haven't already looked at it, Lean Compliance, go take a look at his blog articles. They're really, really great. And he has an upcoming book on effective compliance. He's a regular speaker in the compliance world, and I'm very thrilled to pass this over to Ray. So I'm just going to make Ray the presenter. Give me one moment here. Ray, you should now be the presenter. So I'm going to hand this over to Ray, and Ray, you can take it from here, and I'll keep an eye on those questions and that chat window. If anybody has any questions, put that into the questions panel. And if you have any sort of chat issue, please put that into the chat window. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today from all around the world. All right, Ray, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction and for laying the groundwork for our material and the process that we're going to be following this morning. So welcome and good morning, everyone. My goal today is not to walk through how you might improve your risk and compliance, as important as that might be. Instead, we're going to do something else. We're going to do something different. And specifically, we're going to look at how to contend with the risks associated with recovering your business by creating a risk-based recovery plan. Now, instead of giving you a series of checklists on what you might do, we thought it'd be more helpful to walk you through an actual process, one that you could repeat yourself. You know the saying, give a person a fish and you feed them for a day. Teach a person to fish and you feed them for a lifetime. And that's what we hope to do today, teach you to fish. Now, to accomplish this objective, we're going to ask you a few questions that Jonathan has already mentioned. We're going to ask 6 in total, and you're going to need to remember your answers if you want to get the most out of this webinar. We will also ask you to answer these questions by means of a group poll to provide feedback for you on where you sit relative to others on the call today. Now we're going to go through the material quickly. So a PDF file of this presentation is available for download, and I encourage you to do that to help you follow along and as a reference after we finish today. Now we intend to complete the webinar within an hour and then open it up for Q&A and discussion. However, as Jonathan has mentioned already, if you have any questions before then, go ahead and ask them, and we'll do our best to provide answers as we go along. Jonathan will interrupt me when that happens, and that'll be fine. So our webinar goals are ambitious, yes, but there's much at stake, and it's not time to be timid. So let's get started. Here's the big idea for today's webinar. As the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions begin all around the world, companies are starting to transition, which is a good thing, to the next normal for their business. Now, this requires a risk-based recovery plan, one that reimagines what normal looks like, safely restarts operations, recovers business that was lost, and reinforces defenses against future uncertainty. This is an opportunity for risk and compliance to be at the table to lead and coordinate these efforts to improve the probability of mission success. But what does a risk-based recovery plan look like? How do you create one, and who should really lead the recovery effort? We're going to answer these questions and others throughout our webinar today. Now, we know that each one of you will be at a different place in terms of preparations for your recovery. So this leads us to our first poll question, which is, what is the status of your business recovery plan? And we're talking here about the creation of the plan itself. So you should see a poll question. I'm going to ask Jonathan to lead us through this.
Sure thing. So we've got a poll. As Ray said, what's the status of your business resumption plan? COVID is, of course, a very fast-moving epidemic, of course, and health hygiene crisis. Mnemonic has operations in China, and so to a certain extent, we lived through this last, I guess, January. Our operations are in Shanghai, so we're somewhat isolated from the center of it in Wuhan, but it was very interesting to see what's happened in China and how they're coming out of it. But we're very definitely curious to see what is the status of your business resumption plans as different jurisdictions are starting to open up. So please fill this in. And we're just going to wait for a few more people to complete the poll. And don't worry, these answers are confidential. We're not going to be sharing this information publicly or using your names in any way. So really, this is just from a statistical information gathering point of view. So I'm going to give 5 more seconds to complete this poll. And don't be shy. I mean, if you haven't done something or if you don't, there's really, like I said, it'll be completely anonymous and we're not going to use this data in any way. All right, let me close this poll just to keep everything moving. I'm going to share the results with everybody. So here you see the results with 29% have started to implement and it's underway. Only 3% are completed, ready to go. So if you're not ready to go, you shouldn't feel too bad. It looks like most folks aren't quite ready to go yet. And then a lot of people are still developing things and it's going well. Some folks are still struggling. They've started, but they're not maybe sure. I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but they're maybe not sure how to move forward. And then 12% haven't started anything yet, which is, hopefully some things in the webinar today will help you get started. So Ray, back to you, but those are the poll results from the first poll. And we've got 5 polls. So 1 down, okay. 4 to go, everybody.
Great, thank you. So we got an idea of where we sit relative to each other on the call today. We've got a number of people in different places in terms of their development. Now, no matter where you are, what we will cover today will be of help to you, even if it serves to confirm your approach. Now, the outcome of our webinar is straightforward. It is to improve our understanding of what a risk-based plan consists of, one that addresses the risks that really matter to improve the probability of mission success. And I think this is an outcome that's good for all of us. And to achieve this outcome, we're going to follow a process that aligns closely with ISO 31000. It's a global risk management standard, which begins first with establishing a risk context. Now, here's a definition for risk context. To establish the context means to define the external and internal parameters that organizations must consider when they manage risk. So let's do that. Let's define a context. Now, no doubt, you all have a list. Here's a partial list of external and internal factors that are impacting your business. There are plenty of places you can go to help you generate a list of possible things to consider. And as I've mentioned, this is a partial list. And if they look like symptoms of an underlying disease, you're not wrong. And we're going to talk about more of that later. Now, some of these will impact your business more than others. Some right now, and others will manifest themselves down the road. Not all will contribute to the risks that really matter for your business. So how do you decide which ones do matter? Which ones should you consider first? How do you prioritize your list? We need to remember that risk never stands alone. It never does. It is always connected to the things we want to achieve or protect and uncertainty. Now, risk is defined by ISO 31000 as the effect of uncertainty on objectives, or more generally, on the things we care about. And there are a lot of things that a company cares about. And a huge part of that are obligations with respect to stakeholders, including workers, shareholders, customers, suppliers, governments, and others. Now, another standard, ISO 19600, it's a compliance management standard, defines compliance as the outcome of meeting obligations. Now, these obligations may be mandatory or voluntary. They might address public or stakeholder responsibilities. They may be prescriptive or outcome-based, but all of them are promises we have made which we intended to keep. So you might ask yourself, well, what are the outcomes of our obligations right now? And what will they look like 6 months down the road? Without knowing the status of your obligations, you will not know what your risks are, at least not all of them, and the ones that really matter. Now, effective compliance programs, as Jonathan had indicated in the introduction, will have the capability to report in real time the status of a company's obligations. And this is a key parameter to defining context. Now, compliance, as we know, is more than just achieving only legal and regulatory outcomes. It may come as a surprise to some people, but it's true. Fundamentally, risk and compliance protects the entire value chain by keeping companies between the lines and improving the probability that the desired outcomes are achieved and undesirable outcomes are avoided. These outcomes include such things as productivity, efficiency, margins, growth, profits. These are essential. However, outcomes also include such things as sustainability, reputation, quality, safety, and ultimately trust. Well, these too are essential. And since the outcomes are the effects of our capabilities, we need to know which capabilities are now at risk or will be in the near to long-term future. What about the capabilities of the risk and compliance function? Where and how does risk and compliance contribute to the outcomes in your business, in your organization? Knowing these touch points will help you know what risk, how to manage risk in the presence of continued uncertainty. Now, your current situation is also important to establishing a risk context. You may be in a crisis mode and looking at survival. You're asking these questions. When will the money run out? When will the layoffs begin? When will we need to close for good? Now, every business and every business owner has done this calculation already, and I expect so of you. Now, you may be also looking at how to protect your current business model. You're asking different questions like, well, what risks really matter? What risk can we buy down? These are the reducible risks. And what risks require margin? Call these irreducible risk. Or you may be further along and starting to transition to your next normal. You'll be asking these questions. What does our next normal look like? How do we get there? What resources do we need? What threats and opportunities should we consider? And how do we measure our progress? The stage you are in the management and the management approach you use are part of defining a risk context. Now, all the areas we've talked about so far contribute to defining context. However, whatever context you find yourself in, you'll need to know what role should lead the recovery effort. Now, here's a quote from a chief ethics and risk compliance officer, an article that was published in the last few weeks. He says the following. He says this. He says, over the years, compliance officers have designed and implemented the now recognized 3 pillars of effective compliance. prevent, detect, and respond. Sounds like risk management to me, including monitoring and remediation. This system is equally valid for all risk functions in the corporation, including health and safety, environment, business continuity, emergency management, data privacy, and on and on. Instead of just another work stream, courageous, risk-aware, and crisis-resilient compliance officers can rightfully claim consideration for the lead or at least coordination of an integrated risk management approach for their organization. So, well, this leads us to our next poll question. What role is leading your recovery efforts? So back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ray. I think there's some fantastic context in terms of the situations that different businesses are facing and different types of risk and different levels of risk we'll dive into in a bit of detail. Let me launch this poll. So the question is, who is leading your recovery efforts at the business or organization that you are a part of? So is it your CEO, really right at the top? Is it a chief compliance officer or chief risk officer, if you have one of those? Is it a crisis team / task force that's maybe composed of people from different departments, different business units, crisis team, with EHS folks, with also potentially some financial folks and others? Is there some form of general committee that is just been put together, or maybe that already existed and that's been tasked with this? Or is no one in charge, which hopefully not too many folks fall into that. But again, this is anonymous, so please do share the actual situation in your organizations. And we're curious to know who is leading your recovery efforts. All right, so let me give it just a few more seconds for the results to come in. And let's give it a few more seconds. And I'm going to send one message here to Ray. We're going to close out this poll, and I'm going to share the results with everybody. So let me share these results. So it looks like 25% are being led by their CEO, which definitely has advantages, as well as some challenges. And Ray, I know we'll be discussing that. The chief compliance officer, risk officers, leading 9% of your recovery efforts. The crisis team / task force, 38%. So that seems to be the winner in this situation, where it seems to be good that many organizations have put together a task force or crisis team. And then 23% have a committee in place that's handling this. And 5% of you, no one is leading the recovery effort. So let me close this poll, Ray, and Ray, back to you here.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. So remember, everyone, to write down your answers for later. You're going to need that to complete a decision tree later on in our webinar today. Okay, so our next step in our process from crisis to recovery is risk assessment. Risk assessment. So here's a definition. Again, this comes from ISO 31000. Risk assessment is a process that is made up of 3 separate processes: risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation, which we're going to do now. All of them. So to start with, risk assessment requires that we look at the primary risk sources, which you could think of as similar to what we might consider as a hazard, a source of potential harm. Today, we're going to consider 3 sources of COVID-19 risk. We're going to start with number 1, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Then number 2, the COVID-19 shutdown. And number 3, the COVID-19 impacts. We're going to walk through each of the hazards to understand some of the dynamics involved, starting with the pandemic itself. You can see here a bow tie diagram. which may be familiar to some, but perhaps not all of us. It's a tool to help us understand risk dynamics when uncertainties have a causal relationship with outcomes. In this case, we can introduce measures to prevent the occurrence of a threat, i.e. getting infected, and mitigate or recover from the effects should the threat occur. Now, at a macro level, the primary focus so far has been mostly on preventive measures. And by this, I do not mean preventing the virus. We've lost that battle already. Instead, what I mean and what we mean is preventing infections, or at least slowing down its transmission, as we all know as flattening the curve, which will now be part of our lexicon and vocabulary from this point forward. This flattening of the curve has resulted in a global shutdown, which is also a source of risk, another hazard that needs to be contended with. Governments, organizations have activated emergency teams to look at answering the question, well, how do we survive this crisis? Instead of just dealing with the loss of life due to the pandemic, we face a possible loss of businesses and of loss of livelihoods, which, if the latter is left unchecked, well, it's going to lead to a loss of life in the end. This is crisis management, not risk management. And many are still in this situation, and you may be as well. Which brings us now to our third source of risk, the COVID-19 impacts. The curve is flattening, yes. However, the pandemic continues, as well as the shutdowns and other downstream effects. The question now is, how do we deal with all the impacts and how do we recover? And these are closely related to the questions that we started off at the beginning. What will our next normal look like? How do we safely restart our operations? How do we recover the business that we lost? And how do we strengthen our defenses against future uncertainty? Now, we're going to look more closely at this by assessing the level of uncertainty that we're dealing with. As uncertainty affects not only the threats that we don't want, but also the opportunities we so desperately need to recover. So, as we all know, everything happens in the presence of uncertainty. And it's this uncertainty that creates the opportunity for risk. And to manage in the presence of uncertainty, we need to estimate how much uncertainty we have. And this is going to be different for everyone. And to help answer the question, we're going to look at uncertainty in terms of two ends of the spectrum, order and chaos. Now, some of you will recognize what you see on the screen here as the tau symbol. On the one side, in the white, we have order. It's a world you are in when what you do works. It's predictable. It's deterministic, and by that I mean when you do A, you get B. And when you always do A, you always get B. There also will be pockets of chaos, which when manifested, we usually call them issues and problems. Now on the other side, in the black, is chaos. It's a world you are in when what you do doesn't work. It's unpredictable, it's random, it's abnormal, with occasional pockets of order once in a while, which we might call as relief. And then there's the line between order and chaos. This is where risk management has its greatest utility, by protecting the border, keeping the chaos at bay, and keeping the dragons out. However, risk management requires a certain degree of order for it to work. And that's what compliance helps with. Without consistently following the controls, we create opportunity for pockets of chaos to pop up and threats to penetrate our defenses. Which leads us now to the next poll question. Where do you think you are right now, specifically with regards to the uncertainty of achieving your mission objectives?
Great, thanks.
So,
thanks,
yeah.
Ray. I think that challenge between order and chaos has never been so stark in our lifetimes, at least, where there's just so much going on, that things are changing so fast. There's a bit of an information overwhelm. I think a lot of people, there's been reports of anxiety and challenges, personally for a lot of folks who are just don't know where things are headed. So the question here is, what is your level of uncertainty as an organization, I would say, with respect to your mission objectives? I said organization, Ray. I just want to make sure that's how the question was designed.
Yes.
Or yeah, yep. Okay. So it's, what's the level of uncertainty for your organization? Are you fairly certain? There's good order, occasional chaos, of course, because nothing's perfect. Nor do you want it to be fully ordered all the time. Is it ambiguous, where you're sort of in the middle? There's some order, but then you're having these chaotic events that are happening, employees, stakeholders who are coming to you and asking you for things, just lack of clarity? Or are things very uncertain? You have no idea what's going to happen. Really a lot of balls in the air. Of course, some businesses and organizations are much more affected by this epidemic than others. I don't know if we have anybody on the call from the airline industry or hospitality industry today, but certainly those two industries are in for a very big challenge going forward. So let's just give a few more minutes for everybody to complete this poll. Of course, the more responses we get, the better. So please do click on the poll and try and complete it. Again, all the data is entirely anonymous. And so no fears about us sharing this with your supervisors or with the general public. I won't put it on my Twitter account, I promise. So let's just give a couple more seconds for this to come in. We've got over 50% of people have voted, so that's great. And if anybody still wants to vote, let us know. We are going to use these answers, or you'll be able to use these answers in a bit of a compliance analysis later on down the road. So your answers are very valuable. Let me close the poll. I'm going to share the results. So 37% feel that they're still in a fairly ordered world, but there is some occasional chaos. So that's good, and certainly somewhat easier to manage than the folks who are in the ambiguous, really in the edge between order and chaos. That's the majority of the people on the call today, and I would venture to guess that's the majority of businesses and organizations around the world. I mean, if you're in the government, if you're in a government institution, you're probably relatively safe. But again, the extreme would be the airlines and hospitality. And then, yeah, the folks that are in that really crazy world where we just don't know what's going to happen at all, 9%. And so hopefully some of the tools today will help everybody navigate this. But I think everybody's faced with a new reality and are trying to figure out our way in the forest. I'm going to close this poll, if that's okay with you, Ray, and just send it back.
Yep, that's good. Yep. Good. So there's a feeling of a certain amount of uncertainty that people have. And the question that we now face is, how do we contend with the level of uncertainty that we have? And for this, we need to look at our attitude towards risk. This will influence the effectiveness of a recovery plan more than any other factor. So we need to check our attitude. Here's a definition from ISO 31000 with regards to risk attitude in general. And it is the number one thing that affects whether or not we take on risk, whether we tolerate risk, whether we share risk, how we deal with treatment of risk, and how our whole approach is. So it's something that we need to understand, and therefore we need to make an assessment. So that's what we're going to do now. So here's some helpful depictions of risk attitudes that you might relate to or even identify with. I'm going to ask you at the end of this to pick the one that's closest to your organization, but let me just walk you through this one quickly. We're just going to start with the one on the left. This is what we call the ostrich, the person that puts their head in the sand. This person doesn't want to know what the risks are. Just don't tell me, I don't want to know, right? This person is risk tolerant. This person is accepting all the risk, the good effects and the bad effects. They just don't want to know. And maybe you're in that situation, maybe your company's in that situation. But maybe you're on the other extreme and you're the risk intolerant attitude. This is the avoider. This is the person that, it's not that they don't want to know what the risks are, they just don't want any risk. They don't want any risk. So they're going to avoid taking on risk. And I don't know of any businesses that have no risk. If you're in business, you're going to need to take on risk. The question is, what do you do with that risk? And we're going to get to that in a moment. And that takes us to the attitude in the middle. This is the traditional risk manager position. This person is what we call risk neutral. It's better than the other two. We're going to measure, we're going to assess the risk, we're going to balance them, we're going to determine which one has more risk than another, and we're going to decide which approach to take. And that's good, but it turns out to be not as active or proactive as we need to be, specifically when it comes to opportunities. This is the typical one for dealing with threats, but is not the best one for dealing with opportunities. For that, we need something that's more risk-seeking. And there we end up with the gambler. This person loves risk, probably loves it too much, and given a chance, will probably gamble your company away. So it's a bit too far on that spectrum, which means that we need something else. We need something that we're now calling, at least we're calling it, the risk strategist. This is a person that's going to optimize their plans for certainty. They're going to improve the probability of success in order to achieve the desired outcomes. But it's more, and usually that means avoiding failure. But it's more than that. The risk strategist is someone that also needs to pursue success. Needs to pursue success. In order to be successful, we need to do more than just avoid failure. We need to ensure the success and the accomplishment and achievement of the outcomes that we want. And so this becomes the objectives for the risk strategist role. Now, this leads us to our next question. Is which attitude most closely aligns with your organization? The ostrich, the avoider, the manager, the gambler, or the strategist? Back to you, Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Ray. So let me launch this poll. And what is your attitude? So this is at an individual level, right, Ray? I mean, this is you as a person. Which category would you put yourself in? Is that correct?
Well, I would say from an organizational perspective, from not you personally, but how does it most align with your organization?
Okay, so all right. So how does your organization treat risk, or what's its attitude towards risk? And are you that ostrich that puts your head in the sand? Usually doesn't end well. Are you the avoider, where you just don't want to talk about it, don't want to deal with it? Maybe that's more of the ostrich. Sorry, the avoiders, like, they just don't want risk. They want to try and get rid of it. A manager that's trying to minimize and control it, and do the math in terms of costs. Gambler, that's kind of self-explanatory, that likes to play the odds and have a bit of emotional high, I guess, and a low. And then are you that strategist, which allows you to really improve and plan for the probability of success? Would you say to your organization, which category would you say you're in? So we have over 50% of people have responded. Let's try and get this up to 60%. Come on, everybody, we can do it. So we're at there, 55, 56%. We just need a few more votes to get up to 60%, and then we'll close out the poll. So 57%, all right, we're almost there. We've got 126 people on the call right now, so 60%. Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Past the 60% mark. So this makes this very statistically significant. So I'm going to close this poll and share the results with everybody. So it looks like very few ostriches. That's good. That's good news. Very few avoiders who want to pretend like they can actually get rid of all the risk. Lots of managers. I think this is not that surprising. A lot of folks still really view risk and compliance as a cost of doing business, and they try and just manage it rather than the other two options, gambler, which would be to play the odds, which we don't have too many of those either. And then it's nice to see that we do seem to have a lot of strategists, organizations that are really taking a strategic approach to their risk management and looking to improve the probability of success. And that's a very challenging thing. I think what Ray's talking about today and the depth of the information he's providing in the slides and in his presentation demonstrates that it is feasible and doable, but it is not trivial. And so hopefully everybody will be able to become more of a strategist and improve your strategies using this information. So let me hide this poll, Ray, and back to you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. So that's quite an interesting response. We've done this survey in other contexts, and we notice a difference between management or leadership, let's say senior management, and let's say project managers, those that are involved in delivering new products and capabilities for their organization. And what we've heard more than not is that project managers tend to be have a more risk-seeking attitude, but when they report up, there seems to be nobody wants to know the risk. I've heard it so many times. Don't come to me if your project is at risk. I don't want to know about it. And so even within an organization, you may find different pockets or cultures or subcultures where the attitudes are different. So it's something to check. Okay, so we're making great progress, and it's time for us to look at what is called risk scenarios. It's the next step in our process. Now, this is not specifically called out in ISO 31000. But it's useful when evaluating the risk of possible alternate futures, which is exactly what we need to do when defining our next normal and deciding which one to pick. And instead of using a reductive approach focused on identifying individual risks, and we do need to do that, where you can think about those as the symptoms of uncertainty, risk scenarios help you take a holistic approach so you can better address the underlying cause, or if you like, the disease itself. So here's a definition that you can use for risk scenarios. It's an analysis process where you're going to be looking at future events by considering alternate possible outcomes, sometimes called alternate worlds. So let's come up with some alternate worlds. What will the future look like? And for today's exercise, I've outlined 4 alternate worlds. Now, these are things we've already talked about. We're going to explore them in a little more detail now. We're going to look at what our next normal is. That's one alternate outcome. What a safe restart looks like. A recovery of our business that was lost. What does that look like? And what does a reinforcement of our defenses look like? So those are 4 possible options that we might need to consider. Now, which one of these address the risks that really matter to you? And which ones need to happen first? And which ones do you build your business recovery around? Now we're going to create a decision matrix using the answers to the poll questions you've answered earlier. So I hope that you'll have them available in a few moments. However, we need to ask you one more poll question to establish the last parameter of our risk context. And it's this question. It involves impact. What is the level of impact caused by COVID-19 on your business? Has it been minor, which means your business assumptions are mostly valid? You're now looking at just restarting safely. Or you've had moderate or significant changes to your business assumptions. They're being challenged. And you may need to look at modification to your business model. Or you've had serious changes and impacts to your business strategy. Your business assumptions are no longer valid, and you now need to reevaluate your business. So Jonathan, back to you.
Great, thanks, Ray. So here's the poll. I won't repeat what Ray just explained, but if you want to fill this one out and let us know if you're in the minor, moderate, or major camps. Minor, mnemonic, thankfully, it's probably somewhere in the minor because we're a tech company and we do everything online and everybody was already equipped to work from home. Of course, a lot of our customers are very affected, so there is an impact there. And then moderate, maybe you have both online and physical presence. Maybe some of your products and some of your services are going to be less in demand. So are you in that moderate category? Or major, maybe you're one of those airlines or a restaurant that is in a very, very tough situation. So let us know which category you feel you're in. We're up above 50%. All right, let me try and get everybody motivated to get us back above 60, 65%. So we're 52% of folks have voted. Let's get it up there. 53%. All right, we just need a few more responses. 54%. I feel like I'm running a bingo. 54%. Come on, yeah, we can get it to 60%, everybody. So let us know, are you in the minor, moderate, or major categories of business disruption as it relates to COVID-19? 57%. We're almost at the 60% mark. We just need a few more responses. Those of you who are checking your email on your phones or anything, come on, we just need a few more responses. 59%. And come on, 60, we're almost there. We're almost there. 60%, just a couple more responses. If you haven't responded to the poll yet, please respond to the poll. There we go. 60% of folks have responded to the poll. Thank you, especially to everybody who participated. So let me close this and share the results. So it looks like some have minor impacts, about an equal amount have major impacts. So those are, it's a bell curve at the end of the day, probably. I mean, I don't think we have any real data yet, but I would presume that almost so many things in life follow a bell curve. So this is probably somewhat similar. And then, moderate. So the vast majority of businesses and organizations on the call today are in some sort of moderate situation where there are significant impacts, not necessarily a death knell for the business or requiring a radical rethink, but something that's going to require a significant rethink of the business and of your risk management strategies. All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I'm going to hide this poll and back over to Ray.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe we should have put an option that's maybe some of you don't know what the impacts are on your business, although I suspect that you probably do to some degree. Maybe you haven't done an assessment to determine what that looks like. So maybe that would be a good improvement for the next time we do this. Okay, so it's time to bring out your answers to the earlier questions. I hope you remembered what they were. If you have a printout, perhaps you could circle the answers on this chart that we've provided for you, or just remember what they are. And we're going to now formulate a set of risk-based options based on the answers to the questions that we have. And we've got a template for this, so we're going to work through this right now. We're going to start with the first risk-based option, which is what we're going to call scenario number 1. Now this is the tactical safety change. So this is a low risk option. So here the level of uncertainty is low, as are the impacts. Your business assumptions are mostly intact, and you're looking for a safe restart, looking primarily at COVID-19 safety measures or conditions for startup, but you may be in a different business and then have your own safety issues to concern yourselves if you've been shut down in a partial way and now need to restart your operations. We know from experience that failures mostly occur, accidents usually occur when you turn things back on. And so this is, companies in high-risk industries are going to be following their pre-startup safety reviews and procedures when they do that. So this is a restart that could be led by a team or a committee with support using, the risk manager probably best. Even the risk avoider is probably okay in this case, because we're talking about minor changes or minor impacts and minor uncertainty. But that's not where most of us answered today. As we found out, most of us have indicated the level of uncertainty is somewhere in the middle, it's ambiguous, and our impacts have been moderate. So what would make this a higher risk? Option number 2. So this is what we're going to call the business model change. This is a medium risk option. Here, the level of uncertainty is moderate, as are the impacts. Your business assumptions are challenged and your business model is at risk. Not your strategy, but your model. Your recovery efforts need to be led by the roles at the top of your organization, and you're going to need a risk strategist approach and an attitude. You need to look at not just preventing failure, but you need to pursue opportunities and pursue success. You're going to need those opportunities as you adapt your model. You're going to need to do a safe restart, but more importantly, here's the point, you need to recover the business that was lost, which will require modification, most likely to your business model. Now, maybe you've had a physical business model and now need to add a digital component to it, a digital value stream. That's where a lot of people might be talking about today, moving towards digital transformation. And maybe that's an option for you and something to consider. But it's certainly you're going to need to change your business model, and you need to figure out what that looks like. Now, what would make this even a higher risk is scenario number 3. And this is not where everyone ended up. We had, but there are some people that are in this situation. This is the high risk option. Here, the level of uncertainty is high, as are the impacts. The majority of your business assumptions are no longer valid and need to be reevaluated. You are looking at a complete pivot of your business strategy and perhaps a transformation to something else. And your transformational efforts need to be led by the top role, the president, the CEO, with a risk strategist attitude. And if you are in this scenario, you are most likely already having the necessary conversations. Now, there's variations for each of these scenarios, but you now have a way of classifying them and determining the level of risk management rigor, the due diligence that you need, and who should lead you to your next normal. So let's see where we are as a group. Time for our last poll question. What scenario best matches the one your organization should consider? Jonathan?
I think, sorry, there's a small technical glitch here. I think this poll didn't load into the system this morning, so I apologize for that, but I guess we'll just have to have everybody, use actually, let me, if everybody gives me just a moment, Ray, why don't you just discuss something for 30 seconds and let me load this poll into the system. I apologize for this one, but I should be able to load it in just a few minutes. So perhaps, Ray, you
Yeah,
can.
actually, we can probably calculate this by the answers we provided so far. For those that have picked an ambiguous level of uncertainty and moderate impacts on their business are most likely going to end up in scenario 2. And so they're probably going to match what we've already collected. So this is kind of more of a verification for us. And but it's good to know. Maybe you think differently. Maybe you've come up with a different calculation, or maybe something has there are other factors that you are considering which will change your approach than the ones that we've talked about so far.
All right, so sorry for the little delay there. So which scenario, let us try and at least get some data in here. So which scenario represents your organization? So is it that tactical switch where there's some adjustments that need to be made? Is it a business model adjustment, rethink, where perhaps you have to focus more on online, perhaps you have to change some other elements of your business model, so number 2? Or is it a full-on strategic review where your core businesses, your core strategy just is no longer valid in a world of social distancing, a world of heightened anxiety and risk? Is that, which category, based on the matrix that Ray just went through, which was based on the previous polls, which one did you fit into there? And yeah, like Ray said, we could take a look at the actual poll results and look at this in a more concrete way, but we're almost at 50%, so let's just get this above 50%. I apologize for that little delay. And I will close the poll in just 30 seconds, and there we go. All right, so let me close this poll and share with everybody. So again, it seems to follow this bell curve where you have 27% in the tactical, so definitely some adjustments need to be made, but you don't need to overhaul the entire business. Over 50% of the respondents say the business model needs to be reevaluated, and then 22% are in that strategic challenge where they got to look from a strategic level. Does our business still make sense, or do we need to employ a whole new strategy? So that bell curve again seems to be quite present. I'm going to hide this and send it back over to Ray.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to make one comment here. So given that the majority of people picked business model change, which is scenario number 2, that really needs to be led by senior leadership, which you would imagine would be one of the officers in the organization, because you're changing your business model. However, with the first question that we asked at the beginning of the webinar today was, who's leading your risk efforts? And the majority of people picked a crisis team and a task force, not the CCO or CRO or any of the officers. So that's an area that's to pay attention to, that if you're going to do a business model change, and that's what you need to do, you may need to escalate the effort up to the next level. Okay, so we're now looking at the last step in our process. There's something that we don't yet have with respect to our risk-based options. We now perhaps know which one is the one that we're going to pick, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, but what we don't have is a risk plan, which is why our last step in the process is called risk treatment. Each of the possible next normals will require a risk plan to improve the probability of success. So it's time for us to create a risk plan for our option that we picked. So just to remind folks, this is a ISO 31000 definition for risk treatment, and it's essentially a risk modification process. We're going to either prevent risk, or we're going to mitigate, or we're going to recover. In the case of risk being the effects related to opportunities, we use different words. We use the word enable rather than prevent. We want to enable opportunities. And when it comes to the consequences, we want to, instead of mitigate them, we want to exploit those opportunities. So we have different names for them, but essentially we still need to figure out what measures to put on both sides of the bow tie diagram would be a way of thinking about it. So before we get to the risk treatments, we need to define the scenarios more carefully. And you can think about this as a project plan. It's a recovery plan. It is a project. And it, in many ways, depending on the level of change that you're looking at implementing, if it's a business model change or a complete transformation, it's going to be a change management plan as well. So there are 5 questions we need compelling answers to, and they're the ones here. What is our next normal? We've kind of already figured that out. Is it a restart? Is it a recovery? Or is it a complete redo or a business? But you're going to need to define that more in terms of outcomes for that next normal. How do you get to the next normal? You're going to need a plan. Do you have everything you need to get to your next normal? You're going to need resources. How do you measure your progress towards the next normal? And the progress should be based on outcomes that you want to achieve, not expenditure or time. And then finally, what threats or opportunities will you encounter on the way to your next normal? These need to be treated. These need to be treated. So how do you go about doing this? Well, here's a process. It's a 6-step process that we recommend. It's based on doing what we call a pre-mortem. Okay, so it's a scenario pre-mortem to help you estimate uncertainties and identify risk. We believe, and this is HBR did an article on this a few years ago. This has been fairly well studied now, that postmortems, which is what you do after the fact, are helpful to learn from the past, but are too late to do anything about the present. And that's why a pre-mortem is more helpful, because it helps you identify uncertainty and risks before they happen and while you can still do something about them. So a pre-mortem asks 2 fundamental questions. Why did we fail? And why did we succeed? So you can see it has the parallels with the risk strategist objectives. Now we've provided for you to use a scenario risk canvas to help you facilitate this process, to work through the steps we've just outlined. On the left, you've got the questions related to the destination, where you're going, the plan, how you're going to get there, the resources that you need, and how are you going to measure your progress. And these are the things that you would then go into a pre-mortem exercise and have the people on the team speaking freely and openly about why did we fail if we followed this plan? What were the things that we should have done, we should have prevented, so that we could have succeeded? Which is the next question, is why did we succeed? What are the critical success factors? What are the things that we need to do consistently well in order to get to where we now need to go? Okay, so those are 2 things. And then with regards to uncertainty, we ask questions like, what didn't we know? This is called epistemic uncertainty. What should we have known, right? And what didn't we control? This is directly related to risk measures. What didn't we control that we should have controlled? What got through our defenses? What were those pop-up chaos points in our normal day? Why are they popping up so much? Why didn't we control those? The output of a risk canvas is a list of risks, reducible and irreducible. Reducible, the ones you can buy down, you can do something about, irreducible things you cannot reduce any further, so you have to treat with margins. And margins are reserves, insurance, things like that. Those are the things that you apply to uncertainty that you can't buy down. So here's an example. You've got this for you. You can look at this in more detail and carefully for how scenario 1 might look like. Now, again, this was filled in on a fairly generically, but it will give you some ideas. But when you do this as a group, you really do tease out the kinds of things that you need to know when you implement your plan so that you can improve the probability of success to get to your scenario that you've picked. And then, of course, you can document these roles, or these treatments, sorry. And we recommend using an objective-based risk register. You'll see a version of it here. Remember, risk never stands alone. It's always connected with what we want to achieve or protect and uncertainty. And therefore, our risk registers should represent this relationship. And so we have a list of our objectives. These are the things we want to achieve. And then we have our risks. These are the effects of uncertainty on those objectives. And then we have our measures: preventive recovery for the threats, and enable and exploit for the opportunities. But we need to remember, and I think Jonathan we're on the same page here. Effective risk treatment requires effective compliance to the risk measures. Risk registers have never saved anyone or anything. There's been a lot of criticisms about the effectiveness of risk registers, which I kind of look at and go, yes, of course, risk registers are just a list of things that you need to implement, and you need to work on this. And this is where risk management tends to fall apart. You must implement the measures, follow the risk and compliance procedures and protocols, and continuously monitor the effectiveness of each. You know, I have a case locally where I live, where talking to one of the physicians who worked at the local hospital, and he said, you know, after SARS, we put together our plans, right? So that we would learn from what happened, and we would make sure that we could now deal with something like SARS should it happen again. And all the plans were created, but guess what? And this is the admission was, we never implemented the plans. And therefore they were not ready, they were not prepared, even though they had done the work, they created the plans, they just didn't follow through. So ideally, you will know the effectiveness of your risk measures in real time, as you would for the status of your obligations, as we talked about at the beginning. Okay, so now we've arrived at the end of the process. So just a quick review of what we've accomplished. We created a risk context. We conducted a risk assessment. We checked our attitude, maybe checked it at the door. We estimated the level of uncertainty. We developed risk-based options for our recovery. And we prepared a risk plan with treatments that optimize our plan for certainty. It improves the probability of success. And of course, you would spend more time on this than we had today to work through the steps. We've accomplished quite a bit today though. But now you have a process that you can repeat yourself. Risk and compliance has an opportunity to be at the table and lead and coordinate efforts to improve the probability of mission success. The question is, will they step up? So the next question we have is this. We're not going to ask a poll. This is for you to think about. Is, what will you do next? What will you do next? And If you're interested in learning more about risk-based thinking, compliance topics, we have follow-up workshops that are available for free as part of the COVID-19 membership package. Sign up on our website. You can look at the Lord of the Risks webinar, which goes into more detail on how to do risk-based project management to get you to the next normal successfully. There's a lot of resources there. I know that Jonathan has a lot of resources as well on the Mnemonic website, so please take advantage of all this. So the real last question, of course, is yours. So it's time for Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Ray. Fantastic presentation. I think there's a real depth of information, and I know you have put your 25 years of experience and knowledge into this particular webinar, as well as the other ones that, like you said, are available on your website. And it takes decades and decades to, not to date you, Ray, but it takes decades and decades to absorb all this information to see what works and what doesn't. And so a huge thank you, Ray, for this presentation. So as Ray said, you know, he's more than happy to take questions, as am I. I think this is a deep, complex field of knowledge. So please do pose your questions. We do have a few that we should perhaps answer right off the bat. Let me bring those up. So to ask a question, just from an administrative point of view, just to avoid background noise for folks, it would be to put your questions in the questions panel on the right-hand side. So in the GoToWebinar software, there is a little box that you can click on the triangle to make it bigger, and you can put your question in there. I'll see it, and then I will feed that over to Ray. So Ray, we have a question from John Paul, which I had already answered just while you were chatting, but keen to get your take on it as well. He asked where the overarching company mandates temperature screening for employees entering their work shift, even when a risk assessment might show temperature screening is unnecessary, and even local or regional health regulators and agencies don't require it. What are your thoughts on this? Legal, ethical, compliance issues coming into play. To clarify, we are not owned by the company. We are not owned by this company. However, we must comply to their requirements. We still operate independently. So let me know if that's clear. That's from John Paul.
Yeah, good question. I've got three things I'd like to comment on that one, because it raises some really excellent points of consideration. Depending on the jurisdiction that you're in Canada, whether it's provincial, municipal, or even federal, in the US or where else companies, you're going to have certain, they're going to approach the regulations differently in terms of guidelines. Whether it's a guideline that's enforceable or whether it's really a guideline, it gives you an idea. So you should do temperature checking. That's recommended. But you know, you as an organization can do your own risk-based assessment, determine whether or not that's actually what you want to do, whether it makes sense for you to do, to check everybody before they enter a building. Certain contexts, that's going to be okay. In other contexts, it's not going to be. So this is where you need to apply risk-based thinking and make your own obligation. That's perhaps more voluntary as opposed to mandatory in terms of what's really, you know, what's required. We have one company that decided that they were going to do temperature checking, but they were not going to write down who the person was. They were just using it as a check. So if it's too high, don't go in. If it's too low, okay. If it's just the right thing, then you can go in. But they're not going to record. They're not going to participate in contact tracing because of the ethical issues that we have with regards to personal privacy and health issues. So that was a decision that they made. You may make a different one. Whatever decision you have made, make sure you document the decision and the risk assessment that you accomplished or that you performed to arrive at that decision, because you're going to need it should it become a matter of litigation down the road.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in terms of keeping that anonymity especially around health data. It can be, in some places, it's a legal requirement, and there's a lot of nuance. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? A question from Darla Schnaith. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. So, if your business was deemed essential and continued business, do you need to have a risk-based recovery plan? So, if your business was one of these essential businesses that kept running throughout the pandemic, for the jurisdictions you were in, do you need to have a risk-based recovery plan if you kept operating more or less normally?
Yeah. Another good question. It's hard to answer these questions in generalities because there are examples where we needed to keep the utilities running, right? We needed to have gas and oil moving through the pipelines. We wanted homes to continue to be heated during the colder nights, so they're an essential service, right? So they were operating under reduced workforces, so skeleton crews. Safety critical positions may not have been fully filled. Activities some have gone, may not have been completed. We know that in some industries, the compliance component was deferred. So reporting on emissions and environmental impacts and things like that were deferred. Now, we hope that companies would still do the right thing, whether they were going to be enforced or whether there was going to be audits or not, but they might not have. They might have decided to downscale or reduce that portion of it. So there's going to be a restart somehow, right? Some things that you used to do that you now didn't do during the COVID, even if it was voluntary decisions, you now need to restart up. So yeah, I would say you still need a risk-based approach. You still need to know. And to your point earlier on, Jonathan, there are hundreds of regulation changes coming down the road.
Right.
And you need to figure out what you're going to do with that. And you're going to take a risk-based approach to it because it's the only way to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just to jump in a little bit on that question from Darla,
sure,
I think that it's hard to imagine any business that's not affected by this health crisis. And of course, everybody's affected in a different way, and some businesses actually could potentially benefit. I mean, grocery stores, grocery chains have seen their numbers from a revenue side increase substantially. But if you look at all of your stakeholders, if you look across all of your obligations, you need to do a reevaluation of that risk because your stakeholders may have changed. Your stakeholders, in many ways, might be affected by the crisis. And so I think it's very important that even if your business kept operating, do a risk-based approach. And as Ray said, some essential businesses have been operating, but operating with less staff. A lot of the core, EHS, quality staff are maybe off-site. And so you can have an accumulation of smaller issues and challenges on site at the factories or at the, depending what type of business you're operating at the mine sites, what have you. And if those don't get picked up early, like a leak, for example, and it becomes a much bigger leak, well, that's a much bigger risk. So I think it's healthy for everybody to go through a risk-based recovery plan, even if you kept operating throughout the crisis. We got a lot of questions coming in, so that's great. So let's try and whip through some questions, and I want to make sure that we get to everybody as much as we can. So Tom Martinelli is asking, what types of risks are best suited for risk transfer? So Ray, so what type of risks are best suited for risk transfer?
Yeah. That's a good one. That's one of my favorite ones to answer. I personally, this is where I differ from ISO 31000. I don't believe you can transfer risk. Risk is something that impacts you, your business. You own it. We've been, to some degree, we might be able to, we think about transferring risk to some third party that would take on the risk for us. but it keeps coming back to us is that companies are still owning the impacts. No matter, it could be a contractor that we say, okay, you're responsible for the safety of your workers. So you're transferring the risk of safety onto them. And but that's not what the regulation requires. Regulation says that no, it is the company that's hired them that is accountable for the safety of contractors. So you can't transfer that risk. So in the world that I work in, which is the higher risk, highly regulated area, it is hard to find examples of where transfer of risk makes sense. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not something that we typically deal with. We tend to have to own the risk.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ray here. I mean, I think the higher ups and maybe some of the financial people and things like that, they love to transfer stuff off their books. I mean, if you think of the outsourcing that happened in the 1990s and the public-private partnerships where the government is outsourcing a lot of risk to private companies when they're building highways and bridges and things, transferring is something that the higher ups like to do. But in reality, a lot of stuff can't really be transferred for legal reasons, like Ray said. But also, think of reputational issues, whether it's your suppliers and stakeholders that have the risk. But if you are the brand, if you're the Coca-Cola or if you're the Nike, I mean, there's a lot that you can transfer some risk, but it can get back to you. So I kind of agree with Ray on that front. So from Evan Baker, Evan says, excellent presentation, Ray, which I agree with. Can you address the role of assurance in the recovery plan as a tool to help keep things on track? So how does assurance play a role in your recovery plan to help keep things on track?
Okay. Yeah, that's another good question, Evan. Appreciate you bringing that one up. So here's my thought on this. Assurance with the letter A, so assurance, is there to provide something. It provides confidence that our risk measures, the integrity of usually our financial integrity, quality integrity of the things that we're doing. It provides assurance that we are doing the things we said we're going to do. Okay, and that does apply to risk plans. So there is a quality assurance role with regards to risk management, right? The quality of our measures. Are we doing them? How well are they working? What's the variation, right? Those things are important. But I'm going to differentiate between assurance with an A and insurance with an E, not insurance that you buy, but insurance, making certain. And so this is in some sense, a more important in some contexts, that we need to put plans in place, controls in place to make sure that, to make certain that we reduce the uncertainties in order to get what we want. Okay, and quality assurance checks to make sure that do we have those in place. So I would say you cannot have assurance without insurance. Right? If you don't have a plan, then there's no point in having quality assurance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ray. Ray, maybe it'd be great if you turn on your webcam just so folks can see your good looking, your good looks today. But yeah, I mean, if I come back to a little bit what we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, it's at Mnemonic, at least, we believe that you have to identify your obligations. So you got to have that plan to a certain extent. You got to have the action items you need to be taken, but then you got to do that audit piece. If you don't do the audit piece to go and ensure, as Ray said, that things are being done, you want to audit for, are the actions that need to be taken being taken? And secondly, are those actions effective? Like, are they actually accomplishing either reducing your risk or bringing you into compliance or whatever the action was designed to do? Because we can take an action and it doesn't necessarily have the desired effect, right? And so in our software, one of the things we've implemented is effectiveness assessments, where you have a finding, somebody's not following a procedure or control measure or something, you cite them, you issue a corrective action. Maybe that corrective action is something like training on the procedure, but then you want to go back 6 months later or 3 months later and do an effectiveness assessment to determine, did that training sink in? Did the person, did the person really change the way they're operating that machine, or what have you? So it's that constant, going back and ensuring to assure that you're operating according to your plan. John Paul has another question here, and we've got quite a few questions. So there's about 25 minutes left until noon Eastern time. We're going to try and get through everybody's questions. We've got, I think, another 10 questions, all great questions coming in. So John asks, can a company implement a true pandemic risk assessment when the results of a pandemic could include something minor, such as a new virus, or something severe where all people are vulnerable and must stay home completely? Essentially, in the most severe case, all companies would go out of business if they weren't already working online or at home. I guess robotics would have to replace people interactions or replace services. So I guess John's question, hopefully I can rephrase a little bit, is, how do you implement a true pandemic risk assessment when you have a very wide scale of what a pandemic can represent? The extreme is like everybody dies. And so, in those cases, there's perhaps, not that this is a laughing matter, but that everybody dies. And in those cases, there's not much point in having a risk assessment plan except run for the hills. And then something much more minor where you can have inconvenience, but you can still operate. So how do you manage that spectrum of pandemics within a risk assessment process, right?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that's a question that probably many people have thought, is what could happen, what would happen if we were in shutdown for forever, right? and that's something that you might want to consider. I'm going to use the word practicably, what's reasonably practicable. Okay, so it's a safety term to measure risk, or to assess how far to go. Risk measures cost something, right? And therefore the cost of the measures need to be, some sense, not any greater than the rewards or the benefits you're trying to accomplish on the other side. So they have a word for that. It's called we do things that are reasonably practicable. So there are things that are viable that you can do. You don't have to invent new physics to make it happen. You're not trying to come up with new AI algorithms. You can make it happen, so it's practicable. But it also is not any more than the cost to benefits ratio would allow, right? So that's a calculus that every company does. How much risk measures do we put in place, right? There's always going to be residual risk. How big is that going to be? That's up to each person to figure out what they want to do there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. If we all knew exactly what the spectrum was and where we're going to land on it, it'd be a lot easier to plan. But yeah, for sure, looking at just costs and the cost of the action versus the cost of the event.
Yeah, and I would suggest, so this is one of the failures of risk management, is that our focus has been on probabilities. So the things that are low probabilities, we don't do anything about. Yeah. So COVID-19 was a low occurrence, low probable event. So we didn't do anything about it, right? Yeah. And I think that what we've learned in the higher risk industry is that probability is not a good predictor of outcomes. In fact, what we should do is anticipate the occurrence rather than try to predict it, because we can't. So the question is, there's been lots of talk about a second wave, right? Is it probable? It's low, right? But should you plan for it? Should you anticipate it? Should you put measures in place for a second wave and a possible second round of shutdowns? I would say Yes, you should plan for it and be ready to implement it should that occur.
Yes, definitely. I don't want to take up too much time on this. I think just this topic itself is an interesting one. Maybe we can circle back to it if we have some time.
Yeah.
But let's get on to the following question here, which is from Rob Slack, and he says this is a bit of an unknown at this time as to the reaction and action taken by the insurance business, insurance with an I. Rob has spoken to many business leaders who are very concerned with resuming business, even if they believe they have taken sensible, structured measures. Do you have any advice for them? So, businesses that want to resume, but they're concerned that if they resume, there's going to be an infection and the plant has to shut down. I mean, we saw this at a couple meat packing plants, both in the US and Canada, where they were an essential business, I think, but then they got an infection, the whole plant had to shut down. So, what kind of advice do you have for leaders who have to weigh this? Well, we want to operate, but at the same time, if we start operating and we have an event that shuts the whole thing down, any tips on that, on how do you manage that risk and convince the upper leadership of the right strategy forward?
Right. And then I would add to that question, that's also a personal responsibility, right? Workers have the right to refuse work if it's unsafe. So that doesn't mean they have a right to refuse it if reasonable measures have put in place, right? They still, they're required to work then, right? But it is a continuum, and it's not clear where to draw the line. And I would say that the recommendation is you need to do a risk assessment. Right? You need to make a decision, figure out what you want to do, make a decision, document it, and do the best you can. I can't tell them whether what's right or what's wrong. My risks are, I don't understand what those risks are. They have their own risks. If they don't operate, then they may not survive, right? And that's a real possibility. So It may be better to recover. And people's livelihoods are important too. So it's not just the business, but the people depend on their livelihoods for their life. So yeah, it's I can understand the concern. I can understand the concern. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but in terms of convincing the upper management of the right path forward, it's going through that process that Ray showed, the 6 steps, the pre-mortem, as he called it. I think that's critical, because if you can justify the actions you're taking and the actions you're not taking to the upper management, it'll make them feel more comfortable with the decision that they ultimately have to make that decision within the context of the legal requirements and what have you of the jurisdictions you operate in. But having a robust plan based on that pre-mortem that Ray shared with everybody, I think that's really the core. If you can hand that to your COO, CEO, and say, look, we did this. This is the best we could come up with. Then ultimately they have to make the decision. So Bianca Van de Venter is asking, how do companies handle an employee who is suspected of being infected? Do we place them in quarantine until they can be taken to a health facility? Do we need a quarantine room? And what should we do in terms of employees being fine in the morning and then developing some sort of symptoms later on during the working day? I mean, hopefully, I think that question's clear enough, Ray. I mean, how do you deal with, this person's coughing and showing some symptoms that in all likelihood are just a cough, and 6 months ago we would never have thought about anything, but today in this high anxiety context where there's other workers and obviously the operations to consider, what do you do with an employee that is showing some symptoms? Do you need to have a quarantine room? And what would you recommend in terms of risk mitigation and risk management there?
Right. That's a good one. So I would, some thoughts on this is, first of all, I would look to any guidance that has been published regarding startup conditions for your operations. So I know in Ontario, where I am, there's been 63 or some number of guidelines, each one for each industry. that defines kind of the steps or the conditions of things that they need to do in order to be able to start up and resume business. So that's one place that I would look, is what advice, what guidelines are available regarding businesses in terms of what they could do, what they should do, and what would be a good idea to do. And those things are documented across the different government jurisdictions. So that would be the first thing to do. You need a policy. So one of the challenges here is that, people are making ad hoc decisions. They're kind of knee-jerk reactions. They're kind of saying, okay, what are we going to do here? Well, they need to be reasoned. They need to be principled decisions, and that you have to have a policy. So you need to update your health and safety policy and include COVID-19 provisions in that. So as a company, you're going to need to decide what your approach is going to be. And it's going to look different for different companies, but you're going to make that determination. So that would be the place. Look for a guidance, and second, update your policy and be consistent in the practice of that policy and monitor the effectiveness of that, right? Yeah. That would be reasonable.
Yeah, I think over communicating is definitely a lot better than under communicating here, and making sure that you have clear policies and guidelines and control measures that explain, what's going to happen under a certain situation for staff and others involved. Whether or not you need a quarantine room specifically, I do agree with Ray that definitely look at the local health guidelines that are coming out, and Mnemonic can help you find those guidelines and track them if you'd Absolutely. Like. But you got to communicate that policy, and it's not enough to just do an email blast. I mean, I've received some email blasts from some of our customers or what have you, different partners that we work with. I think sending out a PDF document to your staff is just not enough. I mean, the leadership needs to be involved in a video call. You can make pre-recorded videos if there's shifts and all that. And you really need to get people to understand why you're taking certain actions and what the policies are. I think that's absolutely critical. All right, we've got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to try, and we got about 6 questions left, I believe. Just to circle back, Darla asked earlier about, if you're deemed an essential business, do you need a risk management plan? And she just added a bit of context that she works for a manufacturing company with 25 employees. So relatively small business, but that was an essential service. And so she's looking for, risk strategy. So for a smaller business, I mean, maybe I'll use that opportunity as a bit of a question for you, Ray. A lot of what you showed us today, I think can be done at a smaller business. Maybe sometimes you just larger businesses have more resources. They have a dedicated risk management person. What would you recommend for a smaller type of business, say like under 100 employees, where you don't necessarily have dedicated risk management people? And today with contractors not being able to come on site, it makes things more challenging. So what would be kind of your recommendations for smaller types of businesses in this for risk management?
Yeah. So that's one of the questions that's often asked, is that risk management is only for the big companies and for those that have the staff to support it. And I hope I was able to demonstrate today that you can do a risk assessment, come up with scenarios, work through some things. We did it in an hour, but you could do it in like a half a day workshop. You could have the fundamentals sorted out. So you've kind of reviewed your situation, right? Understood what the uncertainties and risks are, what are the goals you're trying to achieve, and what you need to do to get there. So these are questions that you're going to be asking anyways, and it doesn't matter the size of company. If you're a single proprietor in terms of the business, you're going to ask the same questions. The level of risk is what really determines how much rigor you need to deal with. If your business is at risk, then you need to perhaps do more in order to deal with the risk that you're facing. So that's what I would suggest. And for those that are like mid-sized companies, there's resources available. We offer them, Mnemonic offers them. There are people that can facilitate online working through the process to get people the plans, risk-based plans that they need to succeed. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Doesn't have to take weeks and months.
exactly. I mean, I think the challenge for a lot of small businesses, and Mnemonic to a certain extent is a small business, we've got about 35 staff, is to just find the time in the day to plan. And so what we've done is, you block off half a day and you say, okay, we're going to sit down and really, think through these things, do a reevaluation, and come up with some policies and updated policies, guidelines, what have you. So it's just putting that time in your calendar and being disciplined about it. It doesn't need to be a 3-week process. It can be done. A lot can be done in half a day if you really focus on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would add, it's better to have almost a bad plan that you can improve,
right,
than no plan at all.
Sure. I mean, was it perfection, or perfection's the enemy of good, or something like that? And a rough plan violently executed is better than a perfect plan that's never executed. I'm paraphrasing, I think, some general. So yeah, get something going. That's, when we did that poll earlier, and some people had said they hadn't done much yet. It's just violently execute something, even if it's not necessarily perfect, and then obviously circle back and improve. Emily's asking, what would be your recommendation for third-party contractor qualifications in the light of the pandemic? What should change in the selection process? So if you're going out and you're going to hire third-party contractors for different things that need to happen at your facilities, what kind of qualifications would you add to your evaluation and selection process?
Good question. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends where you're starting from in terms of what's already in your selection process. But what comes to mind, is figuring out, you got to go back and figure out, like, what are our requirements as a business? What are our obligations from a legal point of view, from a best practices point of view, from our own internal corporate point of view, and then make sure that's carried over into the contractor selection, right? Like if you as a business have deemed, hygiene to be of the utmost priority, especially in this pandemic time, okay, well, does your contractor have a hygiene policy? Do they have the PPE that's required? Do they have the training that's required? Going through that. That's just kind of what comes to mind with me, is like taking what you already have as a business, then pushing it down into your qualification process. And then you need to have a mechanism to make sure that the contractors aren't just ticking the box, because I definitely know that happens a lot, where the contractor's like, yeah, we have this and we have that, we have this, and the company itself doesn't necessarily go and audit them, because that's a very time consuming process. So you need to think of creative ways to ensure that the contractors really do have that stuff implemented. And then the last thing I would add on this, maybe Ray, you can add to it, is you got to educate your team about the costs. If you impose, as Mnemonic, we're a contractor to many different companies, if you impose all these new requirements on your contractors, in many situations there is a cost attached to it. And so that needs to be, well documented and communicated within your organization, because if the person who controls the budget is saying, well, this contractor is 20% cheaper, yeah, they don't have all the qualifications, but they're pretty good, versus the other one. So it's about, by improving a selection process, if you can reduce problems before they occur, well, that's a cost saving, but it's a cost saving that is hard to visualize. So you need, going through that process that Ray showed, setting up all of your compliance obligations, allows you to then justify these budget issues, where you invest a bit more upfront, perhaps, but in the long term you save a lot of money. At least that's my take on third party.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with all of that, and only add one other piece to that. If you have a safety management system, then you're required that the contractors have to comply with your safety management system, right? That's where the compliance is and the accountability. So whatever measures, Jonathan, that you put in place for your own workers need to trickle down to the contractors. And that will tell you what the qualifications now need to be if you want to transfer them, or whether you might decide that you're going to create qualification protocols that you're going to do. Maybe you're going to check for temperature and things of that nature yourself, as opposed to requiring your third party to do that before they come on site. So those are things you're going to figure out. But whatever policies you have, whatever measures you have, the contractors working on your sites need to follow that same management system.
Yeah, and you need to make sure you have that, as we discussed earlier, that insurance, auditing type process in place, because if contractors are coming on site, leaving, and you have a lot of contractors to manage, and you have very limited resources in terms of supervision, you got to think creatively about, okay, how do we audit in such a way that we can cover everything, that we can, reduce our risk of having non-compliances. And so it doesn't, maybe you don't need to do an exhaustive audit on all of your contractors, but you do a selection. If you look at, we worked with a shoe company a couple of years ago and looking at, selection and statistically significant selections. And so, making sure you take a sample, right, of your contractors and go through a small audit can have a huge impact on their behavior. Because if a contractor thinks they're at risk of losing a contract, well, it's a strong force for them to improve. So make sure you have that piece of the puzzle in place, is that auditing and insurance. All right, we've just got, we can go a little bit longer than noon. I don't mind, but I want to respect everybody's time. So we have a question from Israel Tirado, who's saying, in the case of Puerto Rico, the guidelines are very strict in the determination of businesses. They have to respect both local and federal regulations. And right now, one of their big challenges is employees who have high stress, psychological, mental health issues as they're beginning to restart. They're coming back to work. They don't really know if the workplace is safe. They don't really know if maybe, and I'm hopefully, Israel, I'm paraphrasing properly, they're just stressed. There's anxiety issues, there's stress issues. How do you deal with that? As the plans are often very dynamic, they're changing as the government is changing guidelines, they're changing as corporate is kind of getting up to speed. How do you deal with a very dynamic, high stress work environment as we're restarting post pandemic? Sorry, Ray, that was a question for you if that wasn't clear.
Yeah. So I would first of all say I commend the person that asked the question. One of the things that we often forget to do is deal with the people side of change. And we're talking about a change management process. Things are changing very rapidly in some cases, or maybe downstream you've got changes that are happening. That's not easy. And so there are change management principles that you can apply to help you deal with the people side of change. Some of it is in the realm of, things are very stable, and you can work with things like ADCAR is a ProSci model. Those are change management steps and processes you can take to deal with the people side of change. But sometimes when the world is a little bit more chaotic than that, you might need to go to the healthcare area and look at guidance and recommendations from that sector in terms of how to deal with people that are under high anxiety and are that need different kind of measures in place in the workplace. So there are change management principles, but I think we're in some cases now dealing with healthcare issues, and recommend going there.
Yeah, I think, Ray, that's an important point. Different people are different, to put it in a very simplistic way. And I think there's two sides to this. You do want to try and do some sort of assessment, in terms of mental health of your staff, if that's at all possible. And this can be as simple as a questionnaire.
Great idea.
There's apps that are out there that are specialized in this, where they ask you a bunch of questions, then they put people on a spectrum, right, of anxiety and stress levels. And different people live in different environments. If you have 4 kids at home yelling and screaming and you have to take public transit for 2 hours to get to the office or get to the factory, that's a very different situation than a single person who lives by themselves. And then, so anyways, you can do these analysis and then use that data to inform your shifts, to inform the tasks that you're giving to people, to try and prioritize and order as much as you possibly can. Of course, there's going to be restrictions. And then, the other element I would add on here in terms of helping people reduce their stress and anxiety as much as possible is just communicate. right? You got to communicate the policies and control measures and systems you've put in place, communicate why you've chosen these ones. Are they based on the health guidelines? Are they based on some other factors? And then just communicate, get their feedback. And you have to repeat everything a number of times. And if you're changing procedures for COVID, but for anything else in general, is the data I've seen is somebody has to do something 65 times for it to become a habit. So if there's a substantial change in a procedure because of the COVID and the hygiene epidemic that we're going through, you got to make sure those people go through those iterations, right? That they get the information, that they get the training, but then they actually execute it, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times, and it becomes a real habit, whether it's washing your hands, wearing PPE, wearing a face mask, what have you. You got to make sure they go through those iterations, and that's tough. The first 3-4 months of any change management is really tough, but it's so important. So that's my take on sort of how to help reduce psychological, stress and anxiety. There's no magic wand you can wave. It's a ton of work, and you got to be attentive to everybody's individual kind of personalities and situations. All right, we're pretty much at the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to end. We have one more question that I want to address, and then we'll wrap it up. So this is from Matthew Brown. And he's saying, in an industry that's been closer to the major disruption end of the spectrum, such as airlines, and so many disruptions to overcome, what are the key areas of risks that should be tackled first after health protection of staff and customers? How do you think this pandemic will alter the course of risk management careers? What is the future of this type of career? I think that's a good place to end, in a sense, is like risk management professionals. How do you think this crisis will impact them, and what are the key areas of risk that those professionals should be looking at outside of the immediate, health and safety and protection of staff and customers? Right.
Yeah. Good way to kind of end the conversation today. I would hope that we would learn from this situation. And I'm hopeful. I tend to be optimistic in thinking that that's going to happen. Prior to COVID-19, for those that have been following me, you know that I often lead my presentations with saying that there's something that we don't like to talk about, and that's risk. And that's been true mostly up until this point. And now all we're talking about is risk. And so there might have been, we might react to that and say, we just don't want to talk about it anymore when this is over. And go back to normalcy, a sense of stability, and we don't want to pay attention to uncertainty anymore. What I've seen, the conversations that I've seen with other risk managers and professionals, is there is a shift that's happening in risk management. It's changing from kind of reacting to what's happening in terms of more crisis management type operations. It's changing from kind of not only thinking about making good decisions, though that's important as risk management, but there's been a lot of more conversations about applying risk-based thinking to ensure and to kind of improve the probability of success. And so that kind of focus on the practical application of risk management throughout an organization beyond risk registers, that's starting to happen. And I hope that it continues. I think not just from a personal perspective and for our business, but I think that this increases a good risk management program that's practicing continuous risk management will be more resilient in the future than any other kind of company. So it's good for everyone.
Yeah, I agree with Ray. I mean, I think coming out of this crisis, which, I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, but my suspicion is that this will continue for a while. COVID is not going to disappear in the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe we'll have a vaccine, maybe we won't. That remains very uncertain. I wouldn't bet on it, let's put it that way. And I think we're definitely going to have a greater appreciation for risk. They were interviewing this guy, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who's written a book called Black Swan that some of you may have heard of, which is this idea that unpredictable events happen and they can change things dramatically. And they asked him, is the coronavirus, COVID, a black swan? And he's like, no, it's not. We knew there was epidemics. Like, we've had epidemics in the past. We had SARS, we had MERS, we had these different smaller crises in the last 20 years. And like Ray said, businesses that have prepared, that have developed risk management plans, that have developed plans for different events are the ones that are going to thrive going forward. And so a risk management professional who can communicate this and who can convince people of it, I think will be well placed in terms of their career in developing. And I think businesses that have robust risk management systems in place are the ones that are going to do well. So I think hopefully this presentation has been helpful for everybody. The handouts are available in the panel, as well as they were emailed out yesterday. The video will be made available to everybody tomorrow via email. There's a couple of questions we didn't get to. I apologize for that. I just wanted to respect everybody's time. And if you have additional questions, you can contact either Mnemonic or Ray. Or if you send something to Mnemonic, we'll definitely forward it to Ray. So just hopefully you can see my screen. I will just close this webinar thing, webcam. And so just a big thank you for those of you who attended. We still have
thank you, everyone.
On the call. And Mnemonic's based in Montreal, Ray is based over in Toronto. We have operations in Shanghai and strong partners in Europe. If you have questions, you can contact us at info@mnemonic.com. You can also go to Lean Compliance, Ray's website. You can also call us. And if you'd like a deeper discussion about a live workshop with Ray and working with your team, I know he offers that, and those are fantastic workshops. So if you're interested in that for your business, let Mnemonic know or let Ray know, and he'll definitely discuss that with you. And if you're interested in Mnemonic software and how it can help you outline your obligations and actions and audits, let us know. We're here to help. So best of luck to everybody. I know this is a crazy, very difficult time for many of us. So best of luck, and I hope that this webinar was helpful for everybody. Please do complete the exit survey when you leave. Have a safe and COVID-free day. And thank you, Ray.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody. Have a great day.